Well, another day, another space. Actually, I had time to do it a little earlier. Usually I record these like at night, towards the end of the day, but I got a whole day to just chill. So I'm going to pick up again reading The Color of Law. So I'm on chapter 5. So just to explain what's happening, I'm recording these spaces where I'm reading out loud these books, and you're going to hear like some commentary and comments. It's just so that books can be made more accessible online. So all the spaces will be recorded, and I'll also make like a main thread where the PDF, the free PDF is of this book, The Color of Law, as well as these recorded spaces. So if you have time or don't have time, you can either read the PDF or you can listen to this anyplace. So I'm going to just dive right into it. So I'm on chapter 5, private agreements, government enforcement. Hold on, let me. All right. So let me go ahead and get started. Private agreements, government enforcement. Before the FHA sponsored whites only suburbanization in the mid 20th century, many urban neighborhoods were already racially exclusive. Property owners and builders had created segregated environments by including language, both in individual home deeds and in pacts, among neighbors that prohibited future sales to African Americans. Proponents of such restrictions were convinced that racial exclusion would enhance their property values and that such deeds were mere private agreements that would not run afoul of constitutional prohibitions on racially discriminatory state action. The FHA adopted both of these theories. So here's my thing. If you go back to the spaces of chapter 1, 2, and 3, they already know that these things don't like racial discrimination doesn't help like market values or anything like that. They know exactly why they were doing it. The way he words it here, and I have to, highlight that this was written by a cracker because it does matter. So the way he takes the approach of wording this, again, he does do I'm not going to give that cracker too much credit. He does an okay job of lining out just the facts, which is needed. And that's what we can take from this as Black people, like looking at the facts of what happened. But then also, too, he does another, like, I wouldn't say sleight of hand, but just cracker shit, where he tries to say they didn't know any better or they were doing so only so that their housing values can, increase. And that's not the case. It was literally to exploit African Americans, and these crackers who sold out to the bourgeois capitalists got very little benefits, mostly aesthetic. Like they got playgrounds in their projects, but still couldn't like access the better jobs. They still had to stay at where they were at. While Black people worked those same jobs, but had to pay 3 times as much for housing that was shittier, and that they were kept out of like access and resources to be able to maintain those properties. So I just want to highlight that real quick. The FHA adopted both of these theories, but when the Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that the racial clauses in deeds and mutual agreements, if truly private, cannot depend on the power of government to enhance them, the FHA and other federal agencies evaded and subverted the ruling, preserving state-sponsored segregation for at least another decade. Well, boom, if I would have just kept reading, it would have just said the same thing. Still not giving that cracker no credit, though. Moving on. So, as early as the 19th century, deeds in Brookline, Massachusetts forbade resale of property to any Negro or native of Ireland. Such provisions spread throughout the country in the 1920s as the preferred means to evade the Supreme Court's 1917 Buchanan's racial zoning decision. The deed clauses were part of what are commonly termed restrictive covenants, list of obligations that purchasers of property must assume. The obligations included, and still do include, such matters as what color the owner premises to paint the outside window trim and what kind of trees the owner commits to plant in front. For the first half of the 20th century, one commonplace commitment in this long list was a promise never to sell or rent to an African American. Typical restrictive language read like this from a 1925 covenant on a property in suburban northern New Jersey. It reads, there shall not be erected or maintained without the written consent of the party of the first part on said premises, any slaughterhouse, smith shop, forge furnace, steam engine, brass foundry, nail, iron, or other foundry, any manufactory of gunpowder, glue, varnish, vitriol, or turpentine, or for the tanning, dressing, or preparing of skin, hides, or leathering, or for carrying on a noxious, dangerous, or offensive trade. All toilet outhouses should be suitably screened. No part of said premises shall be used for an insane or inebriate or other asylum or cemetery or place of burial or for any structure other than a dwelling for people of the Caucasian race. So basically, that was a long way of saying that the houses they built, they made sure to put in the deeds and with other regulations, local and state, that you couldn't like sell houses to African Americans. That's just a long way to say it. And I wanted to point out too that some of these restrictions that the FHA imposed, you'll also find it in current times if anyone owns a house that belongs to a HOA, that they have these same restrictions down to this day. There's you can't paint your house certain colors. You can't have your mailbox a certain height. There's a whole bunch of shit, which seems like, oh, that's benign. That's not the real. No, but it's very real reasons why they have it in this way. It's so that in some HOA clauses, especially in Houston, let's say that you decide to do like a garden in your backyard without getting the HOA's approval, you could literally lose your house. They could put a lien on your house for that. It's crazy. We should start looking more into this, but that's why I say this book is important, because even though, it's talking about stuff that happened in the early 1900s and the mid, it actually still holds true today. Almost all such documents created exceptions for live-in households or childcare workers. It dispatches from a 1950 covenant on property in the Westlake subdivision of Daly City, California. The real property above described, or any portion thereof, shall never be occupied, used, or resided on by any person not of the white or Caucasian race, except in the capacity of a servant or domestic employed thereon as such by a white Caucasian owner, tenant, or occupant. So basically, no Black person can live in that house unless they were like a maid or like a babysitter or a nanny for a cracker, is basically what that said. And they had this written in deeds. The effectiveness of a house deed that contained a racial covenant was limited, however. If a white family sold a property to an African American, it was difficult, although not impossible, for a neighbor to establish standing in court to reverse the sale and have the Black family evicted, because the covenant was a contract between the present and previous owner. If the contract was violated, the original owner, not a neighbor, was the directly injured party. The subdivision developer who initially inserted the clause in the deed might have had standing, but in most cases, once he had sold each of the homes, he no longer had much interest in who the subsequent buyers might be. So there was this book I was reading, right, where they were talking about, some of the racial discriminations that Black people faced in housing. And one of them was, which, this paragraph talked about, how, let's say a cracker sold their house to a Black family, the neighbor could literally turn you in. They would get evicted, and then that white family would have to find someone else to buy that house. But because they sold it to a Black family, it would oftentimes, they would get like, for lack of a better term, like blackballed, that no one would want to buy the house. They would know like, oh, those are race traders. Don't buy the house from them. Shit like that happened a lot. So increasingly in the 20th century, racial covenants took the form of a contract among all owners in a neighborhood. Under these conditions, a neighbor could sue if an African American family made a purchase. Sometimes owners created such contracts and persuaded all or most of their neighbors to sign. But this was also not fully satisfactory, because anyone who didn't sign might sell to an African American with little fear of being successfully sued. To get around this problem, many subdivision developers created a community association before putting homes up for initial sale, and they made membership in it a condition of purchase. Hello, an HOA. I hate HOAs, don't get me started. Association bylaws usually include a whites-only clause. In the 1920s, this tactic gained national prominence when developer C.J. Nichols constructed a country club district in Kansas City, which included 6,000 homes, 160 apartment buildings, and 35,000 residents. Nichols required each purchaser, there we go, to join the district's association. Not only did its rules prohibit sales or rentals to Black families, but this racial exclusion policy cannot be modified without the assent of owners of a majority of the development's acreage. Nichols' developments were a racial model for the rest of Kansas City, which was soon covered by such agreements. In the Northeast, the pattern established in Brookline was pervasive. Around suburban New York City, for example, a survey of 300 developments built between 1935 and 1947 in Queens, Nassau, and Westchester counties found that 56% had racially restrictive covenants. Of the larger subdivisions, those with 75 or more units, 85% had them. It was also the case in Midwestern metropolises. By 1943, an estimate of 175 Chicago neighborhood associations were enforcing deeds that barred sales or rentals to African Americans. By 1947, half of the city's residential area outside its African American areas has such deed restrictions. In Detroit, from 1943 to 1965, white homeowners, real estate agents, or developers organized 192 associations to preserve racial exclusion. And so it was too in the Great Plains. The Oklahoma Supreme Court in 1942 not only voided an African American's purchase of property that was restricted by a racial covenant, it charged him for all court costs and attorney fees, including those incurred by the white seller. Cities and their suburbs in the West were also blanketed by racial covenants. Between 1935 and 1944, W.E. Boeing, the founder of Boeing Aircraft, developed suburbs north of Seattle. During this period and after World War II, the South Seattle Land Company, the Puget Mill Company, and others constructed more suburbs. These builders all wrote racially restrictive language into their deeds. The result was a city whose African American population was encircled by all white suburbs. Boeing's property deeds stated, for example, no property in said edition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of white or Caucasian race. An African American domestic servant, however, was permitted to be an occupant. Within Seattle itself, numerous neighborhood associations sponsoring racial covenants were also formed during the first half of the 20th century. Real quick, I just want to highlight something. So as we read through these chapters and it lays out plain, how these Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods were created and crafted, we have to remember that because especially we just saw what happened in Southern California with the storms going on, both the hurricane, I think it was a tropical depression, and the earthquake, that in certain areas, especially during climate change where we see it now, the way the cities are built and designed based on racial discrimination also affects those communities more. They call it environmental racism. So when they have hurricanes or tornadoes or anything catastrophic, a lot of times with flooding, the drainage water is designed so that it goes directly into Black neighborhoods. So that all that sewage water, all that dirt, all that disease, all of that toxic water goes to Black neighborhoods. And oftentimes, if you look at your Black neighborhood, the way the drainage systems are designed is so that they won't drain, literally to move you out. People should study New Orleans and what happened during Katrina and how they were able to successfully get rid of a large portion of the Black middle class using Katrina, the aftermath of Katrina, as well as the charter school takeover. But that's another day for another book. Cities and their suburbs in the West were also blanketed by racial covenants. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. In Oakland, California, DeWitt Buckingham was a respected African-American physician who had been a captain in Army Medical Corps during World War II. After the war, he established a medical practice serving the city's African-American community. In 1945, a white friend purchased, then resold a home to him in Claremont, a Berkeley neighborhood where many University of California professors and administrators lived. With the identity of the true buyer become known, the Claremont Improvement Club, a neighborhood association that controlled a covenant restricting the area to those of pure Caucasian blood, sued. A state court ordered Dr. Buckingham to vacate the residence. In Los Angeles from 1937 to 1948, more than 100 lawsuits sought to enforce restrictions by having African Americans evicted from their homes. In a 1947 case, an African American man was jailed for refusing to move out of a house he'd purchased in violation of a covenant. The Westwood neighborhood, bordering the Los Angeles campus of the University of California, was segregated by such methods. In 1939, George Brown, later a congressman, but then a 19-year-old UCLA student, was president of a cooperative housing association seeking a property. None was available to a group that refused to exclude African Americans. The association, however, went ahead and purchased a piece of property with a racial covenant that had the usual exceptions for live-in domestic servants. Brown's cooperative included a rule that such student must contribute 5 hours a week of cleaning, cooking, shopping, so a student group obtained a legal opinion that each member of the cooperative was actually a domestic servant, and an African American student was then able to join. However, this gimmick did nothing to desegregate Westwood generally. So basically, Westwood tried to get around, being able to move in. So that clause that they had that, yeah, you could live in a white neighborhood or a house that was formerly owned by someone white, as long as you were their servant or a maid within a white family. So what they tried to get around is just basically say that everyone were maids. And so, of course, that didn't work in a sustainable way. They were able to keep the Westwood neighborhood, but it wasn't like a widely practiced thing. Government at all levels became involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive covenants. Throughout the nation, courts ordered African Americans evicted from homes they had purchased. State Supreme Courts upheld the practice when it was challenged. In Alabama, California, Colorado, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, sorry, y'all. Got the pages stuck. Bam. Maryland, Michigan, Missouri, New York, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. In the many hundreds of such cases, judges endorsed the view that restrictive covenants did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements, meaning it wasn't a violation of the Constitution to deny housing to Black people. That's what the Supreme Court ruled. Sick crackers, I swear to God. Local governments aggressively promoted such covenants, undermining any notion that they were purely private instruments. For example, following the 1917 Buchanan decision, the mayor of Baltimore organized an official committee on segregation, quote unquote, led by the city's chief legal officer. One of the committee's activity was to organize and support neighborhood associations that would adopt such agreements. In 1943, Culver City, an all-white suburb of Los Angeles, convened a meeting of its air raid wardens. Their job was to make sure families turned off lights in the evening or installed blackout curtains to avoid helping Japanese bombers find targets. The city attorney instructed the ensemble wardens that when they went door to door, they should also circulate documents in which homeowners promised not to sell or rent to African Americans. Y'all, I'm so sorry I keep stopping, but look how sick these fucking crackers are. Like in the middle of a goddamn war, right? They're telling you, oh, we got enemies everywhere, which is why they kidnapped Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps, something inhumane and disgusting, right? Even at that time of doing that, they was like, but hey, yeah, we want you to turn off your lights so y'all won't get bombed, but also make sure no niggas get housing. Like, that is so fucking sick. I just had to harp on that, y'all. The most powerful endorsement, however, came not from states or municipalities, but from the federal government. In 1926, the same year, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld exclusionary zoning. It also upheld restrictive covenants, finding that they were voluntary private contracts, not state action. With this decision to rely upon, successive presidential administrations embraced covenants as a means of segregating the nation. At President Hoover's 1931 Conference on Homeownership, Harlan Bartholomew, Committee on Planning Subdivision, recommended that all new neighborhoods should have appropriate restriction. To define appropriate, the Bartholomew report referred to conference participants to an earlier document, a 1928 review of deeds showing that 38 of 40 recently constructed developments barred sale to or occupancy by African Americans. The review observed that racial exclusion clauses were in rather general use in the vicinity of the larger eastern and northern cities, which have experienced an influx of colored people in recent years. That's important. I know I keep telling you I'm not going to stop, and I'm lying to y'all. I'm probably going to stop. So that's important because oftentimes when we think of segregation, we're like, oh, well, once slavery happened, they had to put us somewhere. So that's what division they were keeping up. No, this book does, again, a decent job of showing that no, in places where that were already integrated and some where there was like no Black people before, but that had came because of the factory jobs, because of the war going on. They then saw like, oh, wait a minute. We need Black people to work in these factories because we don't have enough bodies because we're sitting up there trying to bomb and kill everybody overseas. So in order to put people to work and have people work these factories so we can keep making tanks, so we can keep making ammunition and all the other stuff they needed to sustain a country and an empire during war, they had to let Black people in. And even though they paid Black people yet less, it was still more than what they were making. So they would have access to resources if they were going by just money. And so to prevent that upward mobility, they put laws in place to address that. I think it's really important to understand because as far as when we talk about how we got to where we are and why we're here, we need to really understand that this is not an accident. So if we do that respectability politics bullshit, which is it's counter-revolutionary, but just on logic, it doesn't work. Like, you can be the best doctors, the best lawyers, you can get all the degrees y'all want. But as soon as they see too many of y'all moving into their neighborhoods, they're going to put laws in place to put you exactly where you need to be, which is exploited and living horribly. That's what I'm saying. The answer is clear when you think about these things and you read about it. The answer is revolution. I'm not going to go too far, y'all. What is remarkable about this assurance was its acknowledgement that any government involvement in segregation would violate the Constitution. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a part. So, okay. These prohibitions, it explained, benefited both the developer by making his project more desirable to prospective buyers and the owner by protecting his property from the deteriorating influence of undesirable neighborhoods. That just means Black people. The 1928 review assured planners that the racial clauses were legal because they required only private action in which the government was not involved. What is remarkable about this assurance was its acknowledgement that any government involvement in segregation would violate the Constitution. There was evidently some defensiveness about the recent Supreme Court opinion that private racial deed language was constitutionally permissible. That means it was allowed, basically. This may explain why the Bartholomew report recommended racial exclusion only obliquely by referring conference participants to the 1928 report without itself repeating the recommendation verbatim. So that's important because as we talk about how white supremacy, adapts to prevailing norms, you can only, I'm not going to say you can only tell lies so long, but you got to understand like the reason why strategy changes is because all these times we have to remember Black people always resisted and built alternatives. So the system then has to respond to that resistance and to those alternative systems that Black people are building to survive. So the way they responded to it is, again, you want to exploit people, but they're getting fed up and that powder keg is about to explode. A lot of times they just change the language or leave something out that say, oh, we're going to keep this per our previous understanding of this ordinance. But when you read it and you just read those lines, you're like, okay, this doesn't say exclusion of Blacks. But when you go to that previous ordinance, it actually does say that. And a lot of times too, and unfortunately, it's just gonna have to be us learning and understanding that a lot of this stuff, because we're like so deep into it, centuries of this, of revising and modification, we might get to a point where they not say exclusively, oh, we're banning Black people. But that's when you study your material conditions and see like, okay, if this is a result, how did this happen? And again, that's why history and books are so important. This may explain why the Bartholomew report but this indirection could not mask that the federal government took a step toward involvement when the conference reported adopted a recommendation that appropriate rules for new subdivisions included racial exclusion. It remained, however, for the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration to turn this recommendation into a requirement. From the FHA's beginning, its appraisers not only gave high ratings to mortgage applications if there was no African Americans living in or nearby the neighborhood, but also lowered their risk of estimates for individual properties with restrictive deed language. That's just important. So when we talk about white supremacy and capitalism and we say, okay, there are incentives that literally you can get a reward for aligning with the status quo. And these people, they would be called like the middle class crackers at that time, got direct incentives if they held up this fucking sick, violent, racist system. So let's see. The agency's earliest underwriting manuals recommended such ratings where protection against some adverse influence is obtained by the existence and enforcement of proper zoning regulations and appropriate deed restrictions, and added that important among adverse influence, again, those are those terms that they use to substitute Black or saying, keep the Blacks out, are infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. And see, like those terms like adverse influence, undesirables, we need to be careful because that language is very popular today. And to understand like why that dehumanizing language exists to describe the people you're trying to exclude from, proper housing, from resources, their own resources. The manual explained that if a home was covered by an exclusionary zoning ordinance, for example, one that permitted only single family units to be constructed nearby, it would probably deserve a high rating. but such an ordinance itself was inadequate because it could not prevent middle-class African Americans from buying houses in the neighborhood. So the FHA recommended that deeds to properties for which it issued mortgage insurance should include an explicit prohibition of resale to African Americans. The 1936 manual summarized instructions to appraisers like this. This is quotes. Carefully compiled zoning regulations are the most effective because they not only exercise control over the subject property, but also over the surrounding area. However, they are seldom complete enough to assure a homogeneous and harmonious neighborhood, which just means keeping it all cracking, all snow roaches, you know. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances. Recommended restrictions include prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended and appropriate provisions for enforcement. Again, that just means whites only. By appropriate provisions for enforcement, the FHA meant the right of neighbors to seek a court order for the eviction of an African American purchaser or renter. Let me keep reading because I'm about to go off. Because I just want to say that just think about that. Your little Susie homemaker, right? Your husband beats you and punches you in the throat all the time because we live in a misogynist, patriarchal, violent society, right? That doesn't exempt crackers, right? That exists in their culture as well because they're under this system. So the thing is that it's crazy because a Susie homemaker who has to pop pills to get, through the day because her husband is emotionally unresponsive or abusive, or she just feels devalued, she can get her power by evicting another Black family. Like, it's kind of how, like, we see, we know that back in the day, crackers would, blame Black people, Black men for raping them and then see them get lynched, or say, oh, this Black man accosted me, knowing it was their brother or their husband or whatever. So you're talking about in a system, a violently patriarchal system, like people, and not just white women, of course, it was cracker men too that were doing this, but just a white person who either gets cussed out on the job by their boss, doesn't get paid enough because they're from the wrong family. Because even within white systems, they have hierarchy. And so whatever kept you out of like the social circles at work or kept you advancing as a cracker, you could get that power back by exercising violence in the state upon like Black people. That was, I hate it here. Anyways, so the next section. Oh, I'm sorry, the last paragraph. In the FHA's finance program, a production builder who gained pre-approval for loans frequently inserted language in property deeds with preambles such as, whereas the Federal Housing Administration required that the existing mortgages on the said premises be subject and subordinate to the said restrictions. And when the VA began to guarantee mortgages for World War II, it also recommended and frequently demanded that properties with VA mortgages have racial covenants in their deeds. So basically, the Veteran Affairs also said, hey, if we're going to give you loans for housing, you have to make sure you leave out Black people. Then the Supreme Court issued a ruling that was as much of an upheaval for housing policy as Brown versus Board of Education would be 6 years later for education. In 1948, the court repudiated its 1926 endorsement of restrictive covenants and acknowledged that enforcement by state courts was unconstitutional. It was one thing that the court ruled in Shelley versus Kramer for private individuals to discriminate, but deeds that barred sales to African Americans could be effective only if state courts enforced them by ordering Black families to vacate homes purchased in white neighborhoods. Racial covenants power depended upon the collaboration of the judicial system, and as such violated the 14th Amendment, which prohibits state governments from participating in segregation. The court, in a companion case decided on the same day, also banned the use of federal courts to enforce covenants in federal territory like Washington, D.C. A logical consequence of this decision was that if complicity in racial discrimination by federal courts constituted de jure segregation, then surely discrimination by executive branch agencies like the FHA also did so. Nonetheless, the federal government responded to Shelley and its federal companion case by attempting to undermine the Supreme Court's decision. When I tell you we need to burn this shit down, I'm just trying to tell you. Sorry, this is not like a formal audiobook. I have no coup, but we need to burn this shit down. As would happen later with Brown, the response to the court's ruling was massive resistance. But in the case of Shelley, the resistance came not so much from states as from federal agencies. 2 weeks after the court announced its decision, the FHA Commissioner Franklin D. Richards stated that the Shelley decision the Shelley decision would in no way affect the programs of this agency. Them crackers were literally given an order by their boss saying, hey, all right, so y'all been doing this for some decades. We're going to say, nah, not so much. And they literally turned around and said, man, fuck you. We going to keep doing it. Burn it to the fucking ground, which would make no changes in our basic concepts of procedures. Richards added that it was not the policy of the government to require private individuals to give up their right to dispose of the property as they see fit, as a condition of receiving the benefits of the National Housing Act. 6 months later, then Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP legal counsel, and later a Supreme Court justice, challenged the FHA policy of requiring restrictive covenants and deeds of the massive Lemington development. Richards responded, I find nothing in the Shelley decision to indicate that in the absence of statutory authority, the government or any agency thereof is authorized to withdraw its normal protection and benefits from persons who have executed but do not seek judicial enforcement of such covenants. Basically, a long and dry-ass cracker way of saying, yeah, we made the problem, but we're going to act like we can't fix it. I can't stand these crackers, man. And that's the thing. They don't see it as a problem, right? Segregation is needed for the system to function. So forgive me for misspeaking there. A year after the Shelley decision, Birchman's Fitzpatrick, the chief counsel of HA. Oh, let me recorrect something. So when I say that segregation is needed to maintain the system, I don't mean in order for us to have like decent lives, we have to be living in this hell. I'm saying that in order for our lives to be how they are now, where some of us still today are shut out of housing, not some, a large number of us, and even more so by the day, as hedge funds sit here and grab up as much property as possible and price this out. You know, as we find it as like shit in California with the hurricane and earthquake, you know, what happens to people who are priced out of housing, who are discriminated against from having adequate housing? Well, you have a bunch of homeless people who don't have shelter from climate change, and the city just seeing that as necessary, like literally let the water wash them away type shit. That's why you're going to hear me say throughout this audio book and others that burn this place down. Like they do not give a fuck about us. Burn it to the fucking ground. We can't legislate our way out of this. We're literally going to have to start chopping heads. I'll continue. Let's see. A year after the Shelley decision, Birchman's Fitzpatrick, the chief counsel of the FHA's parent organization, the Housing and Home Finance Agency, revealed the contempt of federal officials for the ruling, explaining that the owners in a particular neighborhood would no longer be deemed ineligible for FHA insurance on the basis of an inhabitant's race. Okay, so let me explain that part because I think I read it kind of confusing. So basically what it says is that explaining that owners in a particular neighborhood would no longer be deemed eligible for FHA insurance on the basis of inhabitants' race. Now, if you go back to the previous spaces 1 through 3, it talks about how in the beginning of setting up this segregated community, because of the influx of now Black workers in factories and other industrialized occupations. And now they have the money to be able to move into better housing. To prevent that from happening, they created a segregated system. And it explains how, right? So in this part, one of the building blocks of that is to make sure the FHA doesn't insure any housing or mortgages that would sell to a Black family. And here now, after segregation has been solidified, it's now in its common practice. Everyone's on board. It's basically a self-running machine. Now the FHA now says, hey, we're giving you a concession. We'll no longer like deny you insurance policies on your mortgage. That's what I mean by like false victories. I'm pretty sure we would look at that and be like, oh, that's a step forward. When in actuality, when we see the whole picture, it's actually part of the plan still going along with segregation. And it explains how later. Hence, because remember, so even if the FHA says I'll insure you, even if you sell to African Americans, they have other mechanisms in place, like we just described in the book, that make sure that no one will sell to African Americans. So it don't matter that their mortgages can get insured. They already have people on board where neighbors will turn in and sue other neighbors for selling to African Americans. We have the people have now been deputized with the power to be able to evict neighbors if they're Black. So all that's going on now. And so now the FHA is like, we're good now. We done been delivered. We're no longer white supremacists. We'll give you an insurance, knowing good and well that the system is already self-propelling. They need not to do that anymore. So it doesn't affect it either way. That makes sense. Fitzpatrick did not explain what objective standards could possibly justify denying mortgage insurance because of race, but he was doubtlessly referring to the FHA's conviction that property values invariably decline if African Americans' family live nearby. I hate these crackers with a passion. FHA field staff understood perfectly what Fitzpatrick had in mind. In 1948, a group of families had formed a cooperative to build and occupy 16 homes in Lombard, Illinois, a suburb about 20 miles west of Chicago. Like the cooperative that Wallace Stegner had helped lead in California, the Lombard group was racially inclusive, counting 2 African-American families among its members. As it did when beseeched by Stegner and his colleagues, the FHA refused to insure mortgages for the cooperative because of its refusal to bar non-whites. William J. Lockwood, the assistant commissioner of the FHA, wrote to the cooperative that the agency could not insure the project because infiltration of Negroes would be unacceptable to the local real estate market. As Thurgood Marshall pointed out in a memo to President Truman, allowing local real estate markets to trump constitutional rights was no different from racial zoning and ordinances found unconstitutional 20 years earlier, in which a vote of residents on a block could determine whether Black families could move in. In 1949, after the Supreme Court Shelley's decision, the leaders of the Lombard Cooperation tried to persuade the FHA to consider. They met with the chief of Chicago area of FHA office. Sorry, y'all, real quick, because it's on my mind. So when I think about shit like this, like how the community got together and made sure to keep Black people out of housing and shelter, oftentimes tell people, like, when we talk out here on what a community looks like and how y'all know we can literally have neighborhoods in which we know all the neighbors, we know our people, and we decide to say, hey, no fascists are allowed to live here. No police is allowed to come in here. Like, we could literally do that. I just wanted to point that out because oftentimes people would be like, oh, you can't discriminate, that's bad. No. Discriminating against Black people and keeping them out of housing and shelter is wrong. That's a violation of human rights. And I'm not saying because it's on paper. I'm just saying just cosmically, that's fucking wrong morally. But saying a fascist can't have a safe place to breathe and have community, that's actually morally right because we understand what fascism is. And just saying the cops, the arm of the state that hunt and help enforce these segregation laws, who sit there and kidnap our people and our kids and put them in the prison industrial complex, is very, very morally right to discriminate against them. I'm just saying we should rethink like how community is and stop letting the words community be imposed upon us and actually build the community we want to see and live in. But I'll continue. In 1949, after Supreme Court Shelley's decision, the leaders of the Lombard Cooperative tried to persuade the FHA to reconsider. They met the chief, and what they tried to get the FHA to reconsider is that they tried to convince them that Black people moving in wouldn't lower property values. But again, remember, y'all, the excuse of lowering property values was a propaganda, basically, talking point created to justify the real reason on why they were doing segregation, is to make sure Black people cannot have any kind of access to resources and can only be in a permanent state of exploitation. The leaders protested that the federal government was creating the kind of segregation that Shelley was intended to prevent. The officials responded that they had no responsibility for a social policy, that they were just a business organization that could consider only the cold facts and the elements of risk, and that interracial community was a bad risk, and that FHA could not insure. Again, when these races talk about, I only talk about logic and not emotion. We already know that's a lie. Again, shoot through that shit. Every talking point, if y'all decide to debate these crackers, I don't know why anyone would waste their time, but if you decide, understand they're not operating off of logic. On December 2, 1949, a year and a half after the Shelley decision, U.S. Solicitor General Philip Perlman announced that the FHA could no longer insure mortgages with restricted covenants. But he said the new policy would apply only to those executed after February 15, 1950, 2.5 months after his announcement and nearly 2 years after the Supreme Court's ruling. This delay could only have been designed to permit property owners to hurry, before the deadline to record restrictions where they hadn't previously existed. The new rules, the Solicitor General stated, would not affect mortgage insurance already in force and will apply only to properties where the covenant in question and the insured mortgage are recorded after the 2.5-month delay. Upon hearing the Solicitor General's announcement, the FHA executive board announced that it would ignore it, resolving that it should be made entirely clear that violation of the new ban on insuring mortgages with restrictive covenants would not invalidate insurance. Y'all. Mm-mm-mm. The day after Perman's announcement, FHA Commissioner Richards sent a memo to all field offices emphasizing that they should continue to insure properties with new restrictive covenants that were not recorded with counties, but were, as he put it, gentlemen agreements, and that the new policy would not apply to any FHA commitments for insurance that had already been made, nor to property where applications were pending. Then, to emphasize how much the agency opposed the spirit of the new rules, Richard's memo added that the agency would not attempt to control any owner in determining what tenants he shall have or to whom he shall sell his property. Officials' disdain for the Supreme Court's ruling was apparent. An article in the New York Times reporting on the memo was headlined, "No Change Viewed in Work of FHA." So basically what that said is, even though, like we talked about Thurgood Marshall, fighting within the constraints of the law, right? To try to speak their language, learn their language, speak it, and say, okay, y'all say that y'all are discriminating for this reason, but this violates what you said 20 years prior. Therefore, this is unconstitutional, right? Working within those terms. Got one, and still, people are like, and? Like, we gonna keep doing what we doing. What are y'all niggas gonna do? Was basically their response. In February 1950, the FHA began its lackluster compliance with Shelley. It continued to insure properties with covenants that were not explicitly racial. Instead, these agreements were designed to evade the court's intent by requiring neighbors or a community board to approve any sale. So they're like, all right, we ain't gonna say niggas ain't allowed, but we want the community to form their own little boards voluntarily, and y'all make sure niggas don't come in the neighborhood. So, yo. Revolution is the only answer, I'm telling you. Another year and a half later, an assistant FHA commissioner stated that it was not the purpose of these rules to forbid segregation. Again, it's not the purpose to forbid segregation or deny the benefits of National Housing Act to persons who might be unwilling to disregard race, color, or creed in the selection of their purchasers or tenants. With Solicitor General Perlman made his 1949 announcement, unnamed FHA officers, and the New York Times, that the agency would go beyond the Shelley decision and not insure developers who, even without restrictive covenants, refused to sell or rent to African Americans. This was plainly untrue. As the agency continued to finance developments, Westlake and Daly City, California is one example, through the 1950s that excluded African American purchasers. Only in 1962, when President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order prohibiting the use of federal funds to support racial discrimination in housing, did the FHA cease financing subdivision developments whose builders openly refused to sell to Black buyers. Although in 1948, Shelley ruling forbade courts from ordering evictions, parties to restrictive covenants continued for another 5 years to bring suits for damages against fellow signatories who violated their pacts, and 2 state Supreme Courts upheld the property as such damage awards. So what those lines just described is saying that in 1948, even though it forbade the courts from ordering evictions, the courts were still ruling in favor of people who were taking Black neighbors to court for moving into a house that they paid for. These crackers are crazy. The court took the position that the neighbors of a homeowner who violated a restrictive covenant could sue the seller for damages, even though they could no longer obtain a court order evicting the purchaser. The other was the Oklahoma Supreme Court, which went a step further, finding that Shelley did not preclude neighbors from suing both seller and purchaser for engaging in a conspiracy to diminish a community's property values. So that's important too, because segregation didn't look the same everywhere. Like, even though in some places they'll say like, oh, well, we can't evict the Black family, but we can sue the seller, right? And in some places they did both. And again, I cannot harp on it enough because I'm almost done with this chapter. But these systems, they weren't always there. Literally, they were made in 1930 in response to the influx of Black people working in factories. Once they were leaving from the South and they had higher education than some of the crackers in the North, because some of the crackers didn't need to go to school. They would just go to work. So what was happening is, and that explains it in chapter 2 a lot, about how when Black people left the South and went to the North, a lot of them had more education than the white people in the North that they were competing against for factory jobs. So to make sure to keep the odds in the mediocre crackers' favor, they literally created a system, and that system is called segregation. And it didn't only affect housing. In some cases, the FHA continued to ensure developments with racially explicit covenants that provided for violators to pay exorbitant damages rather than cancel sales and evict African American residents. So basically in this area, the way that they got around the law is if you did get a house and they sold it to you, well, then you had to pay, on top of paying 3 times what the house is worth, on top of being cut out from resources to maintain that house. So your house is falling apart, right? You have this large mortgage to pay. Now also you have to pay the fees that the FHA imposed upon you for moving into a house that you bought. In the case of the subdivision in Westlake, the first homes were sold in 1949 for about $10,000. By 1955, the typical price was about $15,000. The covenant provided for damages of $2,000 to each of the 8 closest neighbors to prohibitive amounts that exceeded the value of the property itself. In 1953, the Supreme Court ended this. Y'all ran into a word I do not know how to say. Circumvention. Oh, hey, look at me learning. Circumvention of Shelley. It ruled that the 14th Amendment precluded state courts not only from evicting African Americans from homes purchased in defiance of a restrictive covenant, but also from adjudicating suits to recover damages from property owners who made such sales. So real quick, y'all, when they say shit like this in books or wherever you hear people talk like this, like, oh, prevented African Americans from moving into white communities, understand that our people did not desire to be next to these crackers. These are the same crackers that on Sunday would hang our bodies from trees and have picnics under it. There was no rush to be around these snow roaches. And when they frame it like that, understand you have to actively resist it because that is part of conditioning as well. What our people were wanting, what they deserved was adequate housing and that they had worked for it. Don't get me started on my communist shit where housing should be free. But under this capitalist system, according to their rules that they created, these Black people met those rules and were still denied adequate housing. So no, it wasn't segregation or integration, wasn't this urge to be next to crackers. It was that they were building better houses in some areas. And at the same time, the only ones they would let Black people be would be further away from the job. So you're talking about an hour plus commute to a job, right? And then also the shitty houses that they would give you. A lot of them weren't even houses. They were like barracks, old army barracks. Again, run down army barracks. You're talking about no plumbing, all kind of just horrendous living conditions. You work and have more experience than your white mediocre counterpart, but yet he lives in a 3-bedroom house that he only paid like $5,000 for. And you live in a house that you pay like shit, $20,000 for. That's a barrack that you share with 2 other families because you're kept out of housing. A lot of people are homeless, and the way Black people are as communal and, as we operate to look out for each other, of course, we're sharing housing with others. And, there's a financial aspect to it too, because how else can you afford a $30,000 home at that time, being paid the lowest on your job? Well, Black families began to start living together in tight quarters and splitting the bills to survive. Again, burn this motherfucker down. It took another 19 years before a federal appeals court ruled that the covenants themselves violate the Fair Housing Act. It's literally in the name. I hate these people. And that recorded deals with such clauses would constitute state action in violation of the 14th Amendment. It's so funny that the 14th Amendment keeps coming up. I do have a book about it that I really want to read to y'all because we have these groups online who, again, are funded by right-wing think tanks who are literally promoting to get rid of the 14th Amendment. All the children left behind, I swear to God, George Bush will pay for his crimes. As the court observed, such provisions, even if they lacked power, still would make Black purchasers reluctant to buy into white neighborhoods. If the recorded deeds gave implicit recognition of the racial prohibition and gave an official imprimatur to the message that the purchasers should not live where they were not wanted. Since the 1950s, new restrictive covenants have rarely been recorded, but in most states, old ones, though without legal authority, can be difficult to remove from deeds without great legal expense. The Supreme Court decision in Shelley versus Kramer, banning court enforcement of restrictive covenants, have been unanimous, 6-0. 3 of the 9 justices excused themselves from participating because their objectivity might have been challenged. There were racial restrictions covering the homes in which they lived. I hate these crackers. So that's the end of chapter 5. So, of course, this book has like a total of 20 chapters. So you'll find the spaces with each chapter. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end the space. Appreciate y'all.